Yes, I've been teaching science for a long time, but tonight's presentation is not about science. Tonight's presentation is about economics. It is about the economic cost of climate change. So let's get right into it. Brief overview of what we're going to be talking about here. I'll tell you just a touch about Citizens Climate Lobby, who I'm representing this evening. We'll answer this question, so what if the climate is changing? And then we'll do a brief review of the effects of climate change. Then we'll talk about the economic cost of climate change directly, what we can do about it, and we'll figure out whether our government is up to the task. And I'll give you a spoiler on that last question. The answer is yes. Our government is absolutely up to the task of dealing with this. All right. So, what is Citizens Climate Lobby? Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonpartisan and nonprofit group with approximately 60,000 members and over 380 chapters worldwide. You can see we're heavily concentrated in the United States. That is a map of our chapters. But we do have a presence all over the world, and we have chapters in most congressional districts in the United States. And what we do is we work with all citizens and elected officials with the goal of passing a piece of legislation called Carbon Fee and Dividend. And when we say all citizens and elected officials, we mean all. We talk to everybody. We work with Democrats, we work with Republicans, we work with independents, and we believe that everybody has a role to play in solving this problem. And our legislation is laser focused on climate change. We did our best to structure it so that it does not affect any other aspect of our society. It just gets this climate thing under control so we can move on with the business of engaging in the world. So, let's answer this question first. So what if the climate is changing? If you listen to the debates about climate change, you may hear some people saying that doomsday is coming and we're all going to be extinct in 100 years because of climate change. Other people say, it's nothing we should worry about, we'll adapt, we'll take care of it. It's nothing, you don't have to do any policy for it because, that would be too costly, so let's just ignore it for now. We'll deal with the problems as they arise. Well, I can promise you, as far as I know, that there is virtually no chance of the human race going extinct from climate change in 100 years, or probably any time soon. And there is a little bit of merit to the argument that, it's not going to be as bad as some people say. But let's get at this question at its core. So what if the climate is changing? Let's start here by looking at the picture of this planet that should seem familiar to you. What do we notice about this picture of Earth that is different from how Earth actually is today? Can anybody say?
No
What's
ice.
different?
No ice.
No ice, right. There's no ice in this picture of planet Earth. What you might think I'm going to say is that if we continue on our path of global warming, that all the ice will melt, sea levels will rise quite a bit. And while that may be true in the long run, what I'm actually going to tell you is that this is the way the Earth has been for the majority of the past 500 million years. So only about 10% of that time, in the past 500 million years, has there been ice caps and glaciers on our planet, permanent long-term ice. The majority of the time there hasn't been, so that begs the question, who cares if we're going back to the normal state of the planet, being warmer, greener, bluer than it is today, all right? Also, the human species has been through climate change before. We have, according to the fossil record, we've been around for 200,000 to 300,000 years, and during that time we've been in and out of ice ages with drastically changed sea levels, different average temperatures. So again, what is the problem now? Who cares if the climate is changing if we've been through it before? Well, here's the key point. The climate we live in now has been this way for roughly 10,000 years, very stable. And what has the human species done in the last 10,000 years? Yes, we've evolved, we've grown, we've exploded in our population size, and most importantly for climate change, we have built our very impressive, very amazing, very beautiful, but also very expensive and very permanent civilization. The structures of our cities, the infrastructures of our countries, we built this all in the last 10,000 years. And they were not meant to be moved the way we built them, okay? So the problem is not that the climate is changing. The problem is that our civilization, the way we built it, is adapted to the current stable climate of the past 10,000 years. Now let's look at this visually. A village like this is easy to move. When we lived in smaller groups and our housing was less expensive, smaller, portable, easy to rebuild, easy to move, it wasn't a big deal if the sea levels rose over a couple hundred years, or the herds we hunted migrated because the grasslands changed their positions on the continents. We moved with them. We probably didn't even really notice, right? But a village like this is not easy to move, and that's the issue. Because remember, it's the climate that determines where the coastlines are. It's the climate that determines where the best farmland is. It's the climate that determines where it's comfortable to live. So it's the climate that ultimately determined where we built our country. And as these things change, the coastlines move inland, the farmland moves northward, and the southern United States becomes very, very hot, much less comfortable, and we lose the seasonality of the northern United States. We're losing our prime place on this planet with these nice coastlines and farmland and temperatures and all that. And by the way, if all the ice does eventually melt, if we really do nothing and melt all the ice, sea level is 80 meters higher than it would be today, which is 240 feet higher, which on one of these Manhattan buildings is about 24 stories. So ultimately, this is a non-defendable position. We cannot save the cities ultimately from sea level rise. Now, that being said, no one's saying all the ice is going to be gone in the next 100 years. But ultimately, it's a huge and insurmountable problem. Okay. But to bring this down to a less dramatic level, sea level rise, it is worth noting that in places like Florida, Miami-Dade County to be specific, it only takes another 68 centimeters of sea level rise, and 70% of Miami-Dade County in Florida will be underwater at high tides. And I'll show you some evidence of that in just a little bit. But that is a ton of people, a ton of real estate, and a ton of resources gone in just 68 centimeters. Projections of sea level rise by the end of the century are between 50 and like 74 or 80 centimeters. So it's within that range, and then Miami-Dade County is under severe threat. All right, so what's causing climate change? This is in a nutshell. The story is much more complicated than this. This isn't a science lecture, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. If during the question and answer section you have more questions about this, I'm happy to answer them. But in a nutshell, it's carbon dioxide from the combustion of fossil fuels is the primary concern of climate change. Now, there are other things we do on this planet that warm the planet, and there are actually some things from human activity that cool the planet. But generally, those other activities cancel each other out because they're both kind of short-term. Our cooling activities and our other warming things that we do, they kind of cancel each other out because they're shorter term. And if we stop behaving as we do, those things will kind of disappear in a few decades. Carbon dioxide is the long-term gas that stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. And it absorbs heat coming from the planet and re-radiates it back down to us, ultimately. And we are certain that it is coming from the combustion of fossil fuels because of the chemical signature of the carbon in the carbon dioxide, which again, I'm happy to elaborate on after the presentation, but I don't want to get into it now because it takes a little explaining. What are the threats from climate change? In a nutshell, these are the physical changes that are happening on the Earth right now. We're getting higher global average temperatures, ocean acidification, melting glaciers, rising sea levels, more frequent high-intensity weather events such as downpours, tornadoes, and hurricanes, loss of ecosystems, and severe droughts. These physical changes kind of lead to us seeing more of this kind of stuff in the news. We hear about the diminishment of the ocean food chain, about the food chain in the ocean being under threat, and then countries that depend on ocean food, the food supply being under threat. Water shortages, lots of countries and places depend on melting glacier water for the rivers in the summer. If those glaciers are gone, those rivers are gone. These are big rivers. Melting snowpack also provides lots of water for rivers in the summer. So if we don't have the snow, we don't have the glaciers, we don't have the rivers. Food shortages, loss of irrigation for agriculture, Lots of wildfires going on right now. Higher storm surges with tropical storms. When the ocean's higher, then the storm surges from tropical storms they come farther inland with higher ocean levels. Inundation of coastal land at just high tides. Loss of ecosystem services, such as bees pollinating our crops or the coral reefs helping resist storm surges during tropical storms. These things help us, and we don't think about them much, but these are things that we will have to pay to do if the bee population suffers too much more or the barrier reefs are gone. We have to compensate for that economically. Spread of tropical diseases and agricultural pests farther north from the equator. As we become warmer farther north from the equator, mosquitoes and ticks have longer seasons and things like that. And ultimately, economically, this leads to massive cleanup and repair costs due to high energy storms, higher insurance rates due to protect from higher energy storms, atmospheric disturbances in the future, higher taxes, higher food prices when food becomes a little scarcer, loss of real estate or loss of habitable land, loss of labor productivity, and greater political instability as people have to move from places that are affected by climate change. Other people have to accommodate them, and that can destabilize things. And then ultimately, bigger government to have to deal with all of these problems. All right. So, to drill down and to get specific, not talking about major, incredible disasters and sea levels rising 250 feet, let's just talk about the little things that are happening all around and these little costs that creep into our governments because of climate change. This is an article from the Florida Sun-Sentinel, which is just a local Florida newspaper in the Miami area, I believe, from February. And this article said that South Florida continues prep for sea level rise. And this picture, the caption says, flooding from seasonal king tides at Fort Lauderdale has worsened because of sea level rise. So king tides are the highest tides of the year when the sun and the moon align just right and pull the oceans up onto the land. At the kind of the maximum height that the tides ever come. And now at king tides in certain neighborhoods in Fort Lauderdale, tides are just coming up onto the streets. And then when the tide goes back out, the water goes back out. But this is causing problems in Fort Lauderdale, obviously, because the oceans are literally coming up on the streets. So the article goes on to say, it says, South Florida is taking more steps to protect against climate change and the rising seas that already are spilling over into neighborhoods. This month, Broward County ordered that new flood maps be drawn using predictions of higher waters. Okay? That costs money. Paying people to draw the flood maps, do the research, do the surveying, make the predictions, and do the work. And then it says, Fort Lauderdale raised the required height of seawalls and the required elevation of home sites. If you read into that statement, they're losing real estate in Fort Lauderdale. Because now what they're saying is, the elevation, the required elevation for you to build a home in Fort Lauderdale has just went up. So some of that lower lying land, you are no longer allowed to build homes on. That is lost real estate. That's lost wealth. And then it says, Delray Beach added valves to keep salt water out of the city drainage systems. Again, these are expensive projects for these little municipalities. And then when you think about all of the little minor encroachments that climate change is making all over the world on all these municipalities, and governments having to spend a little more here, a little more there, and this just keeps, getting aggravated and more aggravated as time goes on. This adds up to a lot of economic cost. Okay. One of the more recent examples, if you've been listening to the news about the Montana wildfires, listening to he was the director of the department in Montana who was in charge of fighting these wildfires in Montana. And he said that he has never seen fires like this, like they've had in the last couple of years. He's never seen fires like this before. And he's been in the business for 30 years. And he said the fires, the heat and the dryness, and then the intensity of the fires have been overwhelming in Montana. And just now I heard that they're having to take money from other areas of their state budget to go towards firefighting right now. So the whole state's suffering because of these wildfires. This just keeps happening year after year after year now in the West and the Northwest. I should say the mid-Northwest. Okay? So, what does this all add up to? Can we quantify all these little costs into a dollar amount. Well, this is just what the EPA tried to do in 2013. They released a paper called The Social Cost of Carbon, where they tried to figure, the goal of this paper was to put a dollar value on each ton of carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere. How much is this costing us? And the way they did it is they use these things called integrated assessment models that have been around for a long time. DICE, for instance, the DICE page and fund are the three primary ones they use. DICE, for instance, has been around since 1977. And these models, they take everything we know about climate science and how the Earth is changing, and they kind of apply that to our economies and our infrastructures to see, you know, what are these physical changes, what is the damage they're going to cause, and how much is it going to cost to address all these, okay? And a couple things to know about the numbers I'm going to show you is that as these models mature and as climate science matures over the last 40 years, which is as long as these models have been around, the cost estimates just keep continually rising. There's never been a decrease in the estimates. The more we know, the higher the cost estimates go. The other thing to know is that because some of the science is not entirely mature on some of the types of damages that these models look at, not all types of damages are yet incorporated into the models. So, here's a chart taken from the paper of the numbers that we get. And there's a lot of numbers here, not going to go in great detail over a lot of them, but they just know that as of 2015, they say that in 2015, a ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels costs society about $39. This is the kind of highly publicized number that you'd see if you read a New York Times article or a Wall Street Journal article about the social cost of carbon, is this $39 per ton number. Because of everything I mentioned before, that the cost estimates keep rising and not all damages are taken into account, to study this type of thing, I think that the real value is closer to the higher end of these estimates, maybe closer to $116 per ton. Some organizations push for $250 per ton, $300 per ton. I mean, I don't know, I don't have any special insight into those numbers, but, you know, for the purpose of our talk, we'll stick with this conservative $39 per ton. Just keep in mind that it's considered to be probably on the low end of what emitting carbon is actually costing us, okay? So, if $39 per ton is the cost of emitting a ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, what does that mean? That means that $39 per ton translates into an annual expense of at least $2,000 to the average American household. Now, how do we pay this? We obviously don't get a climate change bill at the end of the year. We pay this in all those things that I mentioned in the slide showing you the effects of climate change. The subtle tax expenses, insurance expenses, health expenses, subtle rises in the prices of food, when crops get damaged by climate change, related events and things like that. But also debt. So, for example, if our government doesn't budget for a major cleanup operation like FEMA addressing Houston, for example, then, you know, that spending for that cleanup and also the economic loss can get tacked onto our national debt. So, whether it comes out of our pocket or it's just reflected in our debt, that's the kind of minimal cost to the average American household. How did I get this? Just $39 per ton, the cost of carbon, times 18 tons per person per year. The average American emits about 18 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, times 4 people per household. You do that math, you get about $2,000. $2,000 per household. And if 18 tons of carbon dioxide seems high to you, how is it possible that I emit 18 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per year? Just think about this. A gallon of gas weighs 6 pounds. When you burn a gallon of gas, the carbon dioxide that comes out of it is about 20 pounds. So every gallon of gas you burn in your car is 20 pounds of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay. All right. Now these costs are going to keep rising over the next several decades because climate change is going to, keep intensifying. Until around 2050, we'll be paying at least $4,100 per household. Again, this is based on those conservative estimates. And this is not adjusted for inflation. So the actual dollar value in 2050 will be a little bit higher because inflation will have occurred as well. Now we're locked in for this because the climate change we've seen so far, there's a lag in the climate system. When we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it doesn't really have an effect for a couple decades. So the climate change we've seen so far is from the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere 20 or 30 years ago. And in 2050, we're going to be seeing the effects of the fossil fuels we are still burning today. So we're locked in until 2050 for these increase in intensity and the increase in cost. Okay. So how bad can it get if we don't do anything? Because if we act, we can actually, after 2050, we can start seeing the benefits of having acted. So how bad will it get? If you look into the total cost to our economy in 2100, if we do nothing, you get a lot of estimates. Some people say 5% of GDP. Some people say 20% of GDP. This one's kind of down the middle. But this estimate says about 8% of annual GDP will be used to address climate problems by 2100 if we don't do anything yet. And versus if we actually act to mitigate carbon emissions and get the climate under control, we can hold that to about 2.5% or even less if we do it right of GDP by 2100. So in investment terms, you got to think about this 5.5% of GDP that we have under our control right now. If we act, we can bequeath upon the generations living in 2100 an extra 5.5% of gross domestic product, which is an enormous amount of wealth we can give them. If we do nothing, we are taking them. Okay. So, what can we do as a society? What can we do about this? Because it's very difficult to ask people to sacrifice a lot for a distant future thing that seems so abstract. Well, if you you gotta look at the economy and ask, what factors influence the amount of carbon we're putting into the air? And if you analyze an economy based on carbon emissions, you find that there are 4 factors that influence how much carbon we emit. The first one is population. Generally speaking, the bigger we get, the more people there are, the more carbon we emit into the atmosphere. Okay? This is not something we want to interfere with. We want to let the human population do what it's going to do. Second factor is affluence, how wealthy we are. The more wealthy we are, the more we consume, the more economic activity there is, and the more carbon we put into the atmosphere. But this is something we also don't want to tamper with. We don't want to hinder our wealth. We don't want to hinder our economy. So let's try to leave affluence alone. The third factor is energy intensity. Is our economy energy efficient, or is it energy intense? The more energy intense it is, the more fossil fuels we're burning, and the more carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere. Energy intensity kind of falls naturally at about 1% per year, just based on technological advancement. So if we were to reduce carbon emissions, the required amount, energy intensity would have to fall by 5 or 6% per year, which is just not going to happen. Technology cannot proceed that quickly. So we can't get that efficient fast enough to address climate change. So energy intensity is dropping, and that's good, and that is helping. So when you hear certain leaders saying that, we're becoming a more energy efficient society, they're right, and it is helping, but it's not going fast enough. Is the problem. The fourth one is the carbon intensity. The carbon intensity of our energy. In other words, when we generate energy, how much of it is coming from the combustion of fossil fuels versus clean energy? This is where we can make the most progress, and this is what we want to target, because we can target the carbon intensity of our energy and leave these other things alone. We don't have to interfere with the population. We don't have to interfere with affluence. And energy intensity is doing its own thing. It's coming down. But carbon intensity is what we really have to get at. Okay? So we just want an energy mix that's less carbon intensive. Smart policy can target carbon intensity without reducing affluence. in our society, you get the most resistance to talking about climate policy because people fear that it will affect our affluence, our wealth, our economy. But you don't have to affect affluence negatively to address carbon intensity, okay? So, how can we do this? How can we reduce carbon intensity without affecting affluence? And we can do this by using market principles and not regulation to reduce carbon intensity. Because regulation does have its purposes, top-down regulation such as EPA rules on carbon emissions. But regulation can also be a drag on the economy at times because it limits what economic players can do. So how can we get around that and just target carbon intensity without being a drag on the economy? Let's take a moment to talk about markets first. Okay, we live in a market economy. The idea is that in a free market world, ideas surface and the consumers say whether or not, with their dollars, they say whether or not these are good or bad ideas and products. And when a person comes up with a new idea or product, demand arises for it. Supply and demand are supposed to meet each other and kind of duke it out. And the end product of a free market is supposed to be a fair price on whatever product we're talking about, fair price for that product, and the optimal output of that product for society. That's market theory. Markets are supposed to work great because they're supposed to give us fair prices and optimal output for our needs, okay? But free markets don't always operate perfectly. They sometimes fail. There's multiple ways free markets can fail. But the one we're concerned with here is when a market produces costs that are externalized to the rest of society. One prime example of a failed market is the tobacco market. So people who smoke tend to have higher rates of health problems when they're older. And in this country, we pool our healthcare resources in the form of insurance premiums and taxes. But if there's a subpopulation of Americans who are sicker because they smoked, then they take more than their share of the healthcare dollars. And everybody else has to pay slightly higher taxes and slightly higher insurance premiums because of the smokers, right? Now, this isn't to blame the smokers, this is the tobacco market we're talking about. Because that means that people who choose to participate in the tobacco market, and they have the right to do that, they have the right to spend their money and risk their health on tobacco products. But people who don't choose to participate in the tobacco market are forced to pay some higher prices because the tobacco market exists. And that is an example of a market failure. And the result of a market failure is that the product, in this case tobacco, ends up being too cheap and overproduced, and it ends up being a burden on society. So with a market failure, you get artificially low prices and overproduction of the product. Too many cigarettes, too many people smoking. And the way you address that is this idea called the Bogovian tax. This is an economist in 1922 came up with this idea. You take these costs that society is paying for the market and you internalize them into the market. So in other words, you take those costs that everybody's paying for the fact that some people smoke and you put them into the price of cigarettes. You fix the price of cigarettes so that they are higher. So the people who are choosing to smoke are paying the costs of cigarettes, and less of the cost is externalized to the rest of society. Okay? This is the idea of correcting a market failure, and then you just let the market take care of the rest. If people still want to smoke, they still can. They just got to pay a higher price for it. And then other people don't have to pay so much for it because, in this case, the taxes for the cigarettes can be used to address some of the health issues for people who smoke. So this is the situation we're facing with fossil fuels. It's a market failure in the form of externalized costs. I just showed you that burning fossil fuels, the combustion of fossil fuels, is costing society as a whole $39 per ton. So the idea is we just internalize those costs into the price of fossil fuels and let the markets take care of the rest. And the effect this has is it just flips the supply and demand equation for fossil fuels versus clean energy, and ultimately leaves the rest of the economy alone. So, Citizens Climate Lobby, we advocate for a piece of legislation called carbon fee and dividend, which is a market correction for the energy market. Just internalizes the cost of fossil fuels into the price of fossil fuels. All right, how does it work? In carbon fee and dividend, the first thing is that you place a fee on fossil fuels at their source, where they enter the economy. So coal, oil, and gas, as they're coming into the economy, you assess a fee of $15 per ton of carbon emissions if they were burned. So $15 per ton of carbon emissions. And that fee rises by $10 per ton every year. Now what this does is this is a slow, gentle correction to the price of fossil fuels, and it sends a market signal for investors, people who invest in new energy products and whatnot, telling them that the price of fossil fuels will be rising in accordance with how much they've costed society, and demand for energy will be shifting elsewhere towards clean energy. So that starts to steer the investment dollars away from fossil fuel projects and towards clean energy projects. Because we know for sure that in the future fossil fuels are just going to be getting more and more expensive. As opposed to the situation we have now, where gas prices get high and then they get low, and then EPA regulation comes, and then a new administration comes in, and EPA regulation goes, and it's all this market uncertainty. This is market certainty, and allows investors to know that it's time to start shifting investment dollars towards clean energy. Okay? But if you make energy more expensive, you make everything more expensive. So there would be an incremental uptick in the prices of pretty much everything over those years before the clean energy costs can get down to the point where they can completely take over fossil fuels. So what do we do about that? Because again, we don't want to reduce affluence. We don't want to hurt people's pocketbooks. The key to that is, and this idea is getting a lot of momentum in a lot of circles, is that this fee, this tax you collect from the fossil fuels, you return all of it to American households. So every American household gets a monthly dividend check from the revenue from the carbon tax. So the government does not keep the money. The government does not introduce any new programs. It doesn't create like a clean energy program and divert the money there. It just gives it back to people, right? And what this does is it protects the vast majority of Americans from the increase in prices. As a matter of fact, the majority of Americans would actually profit from the monthly dividend because it's an equally sized share, and people who are less wealthy wouldn't face as much of a net increase in expenses. They actually come out ahead with the dividend. So this is literally the fossil fuel industry paying the country back, and people come out ahead. About the bottom 2/3 to 70% of the income distribution actually profit from monthly dividends, according to a large study I'll talk about in a minute. Okay. And people's natural spending behavior is to seek out, all other things being equal, they're going to want to buy less expensive products as long as they're of equal quality. So as industry shifts over to clean energy, and clean energy becomes less expensive than fossil fuel energy, then the clean energy products are becoming less expensive than fossil fuel products, and people are going to spend their money on clean energy products instead of fossil fuel products. So it's just flipping the supply and demand equation, reimbursing people for the increase in the cost of living, and really getting momentum behind clean energy. Final piece of this puzzle to maintain international trade competitiveness is a border adjustment on trade. So the final piece is if we import from a country that does not have an equivalent carbon tax, then we slap the carbon tax on their products. This incentive, everybody wants access to our consumer market. We are by far the highest level consumers on the planet. So this incentivizes other countries to do the carbon tax because they can either pay our treasury a carbon tax when they export to us, or they can collect a carbon tax for their own treasury in their own countries. So this incentivizes other countries to follow suit. And this is on the table. These types of plans are on the table in other large industrial nations like China is considering a carbon tax. And we would prefer to be the first ones to get there, to lead the world in this, and have other countries follow versus being a follower, following the structure of another country's carbon tax. Now, when we export to another country without a carbon tax, we would rebate our companies the cost of the tax. so that they can price their products competitively. So this just keeps the trade playing field. Okay. All right, so in 2013, 14, 15, all those years, we commissioned a large study from Regional Economic Modeling Incorporated, which is a very well-known, it's called REMI for short. It's a very well-known economic modeling agency on the East Coast that does work for large governments, states, and large corporations. They even did carbon-based economic modeling for Walmart and Exxon and corporations like that. So we paid for a study, and in this study, they say, okay, if you want us to study your bill, you have to give us lots of money, and then we'll tell you what your bill will do to the economy. And that's the transaction. So you pay them a lot of money, and then they give you a big study that tells you what happens if your bill were to be passed in the economy. So it's one of those nail-biting things where you're thinking, I hope this is good, because we just spent a lot of money for this study, and we hope it says good things that we can use to promote the legislation. And it was great. Citizens Climate was very happy with the results of this study. So REMI said that during the first 20 years, carbon fee and dividend would lead to a 50% reduction of carbon emissions below 1990 levels. This is a massive reduction in carbon emissions, well below the Paris Climate Accords. 2.8 million jobs added to the American economy above baseline. So what this means is that over 20 years, carbon fee and dividend actually adds jobs to the economy compared to the situation with no carbon fee and dividend. Now, 2.8 million jobs over 20 years isn't a ton, so we're not saying it's a huge economic stimulus, but it's a mild economic stimulus. We'll talk about why in a minute. And then 230,000 fewer premature deaths due to air pollution. Remember, climate change is not the only problem of burning fossil fuels. There's also particulate air pollution that causes lung problems and causes heart problems because these are pollutants that are harmful to breathe. So if you're burning fewer fossil fuels, you're putting less of these pollutants into the air. Okay? So these are the big three takeaways. It accomplishes the carbon goals we need, actually creates jobs above baseline, and saves lives. This is a chart from the study that shows what the monthly dividend would be for a family of 4 during that time. On the first year that it was passed, every family of 4 would be getting about $50 per month in direct deposit or a check in the mail or whatever. And then after 20 years, every family of 4 would be getting about $400 per month. I think this is 2011 dollars. This is not adjusted for inflation. 2012 dollars. So this is not adjusted for inflation, so in 20 years it would actually be a greater dollar amount than 400. This is where those extra jobs come from, because remember how I was saying that the majority of Americans would actually profit from the carbon dividend. That means more consumer spending. People have more money in their pockets. The increase in the cost of living would take about half of this money away from people, leaving them with half of it as profit. And then people spend in the economy. So the 2.8 million jobs, according to the REMI study, completely outlines where these jobs arise in the economy. And the inclination is maybe to think that it's clean energy jobs. These are 2.8 clean energy jobs. They're not. There are some clean energy jobs that come up, but the majority of them are healthcare jobs and service sector jobs, because people have more money to spend in the economy. So they're going to, they have more money to spend on healthcare, which is super important, and then they have more money to go out and buy some stuff, buy some services. So the 2.8 million jobs, again, is a mild stimulus effect of everybody having a little extra money in their pocket. All right. Does this work? Is it all just theory? Has anybody ever actually done it? There have been carbon taxes in a couple of places. Australia passed one in 2012, and they repealed it in 2014. Because in Australia, they kept the money, and that made a lot of people unhappy. And they weren't very transparent with what they did with the money. The Australian government wasn't very transparent with what they did with the money. So eventually people said they didn't like this, and they repealed the carbon tax. The place where they did it most similar, the only place they did it most similar to what we're proposing is in British Columbia and Canada. They taxed carbon emissions, and they gave it back to everybody. And it's still going. They just raised the tax even more beyond $30. The original plan was to go up to $30 per ton. They just raised the tax even more because it's going really well. It started in 2008. You can see that their fuel use is way down. Their GDP has increased relative to the rest of Canada since that time, but has not hurt their economy. Their jobs have increased relative to the rest of Canada during that time. And it's popular in British Columbia because people like getting money in their account every month for basically doing nothing, right? So the model that we have, the tax and the returning the money to the public, can work. It can be very popular and can work very well. All right, so can this actually happen? Can we actually get this done? Is it realistic? Well, even more so than when I started giving these talks back in February or March 2017, I haven't been talking about this for long. I had to be, cheerily optimistic. Yes, of course we can get this done. But now I feel a sense of much more realistic optimism because I've seen the momentum of this thing moving forward. I'll show you some of that. First of all, in our society, who believes that the climate is changing and that action is necessary? I think we're inclined to believe that there's a group of people that want to address climate change and there's a group of people that don't, and that's it. 100% and 0%. But that's not the case at all. According to a survey taken just after the 2016 election, so this is, 9 or 10 months ago, by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, 66% of registered voters supported a carbon fee on fossil fuels, on fossil fuel companies, as long as the money was used to somehow increase personal wealth. In this case, reduce personal taxes. Our solution is just to give people a check every month. And this included 81% of Democrats, 60% of independents, and 49% of Republicans. And they subdivided that into people who voted for President Trump as well, and that was 48%. So 48% of people who voted for President Trump favored this, as long as the revenue isn't kept by the government, as long as it's used to increase personal wealth somehow. Okay? If you have the government keep the revenue, these numbers go down, right? But they're also lower than the number of people that are concerned about climate change in the first place. This is people who are in favor of a specific method of reducing or stabilizing the climate. If you just ask, are you concerned at all about climate change, the numbers are higher in every group. Okay? I'm not saying that everybody's extremely concerned about climate change, but people are concerned. Also during that time, a Republican climate council called the Climate Leadership Council, with very high-profile Republican statesmen such as George Shultz. I always get this wrong because I always say Charles Schultz, and he created peanuts. George Shultz, James Baker, Henry Paulson. These are all in the Climate Leadership Council. And they approached the Trump administration in late 2016 or early 2017 to talk about a plan that they call carbon dividends, which is a fee placed on carbon emissions at the point of entry into the economy, and then a program where they return all the money to the American consumers. So it is a plan that has a lot of similarities to ours. There are some differences. We like our plan better, but this is a Republican plan that has a lot of similarities to ours. And some of the genesis of these carbon tax and rebate plans are from libertarian and Republican thinkers. They like this idea as long as it doesn't become a drag and become a regulatory drag on the economy. Okay, since this kind of went dead for a while, but since this, the Climate Leadership Council has kind of resurged in the news. Ted Halstead, who's kind of their spokesman, he gave a TED Talk recently, which was well received. They have secured the endorsements of ExxonMobil for their plan, a large oil company, and I think a few other oil companies, and lots of high-profile corporate endorsers they have secured, and they're starting to work with Congress in that regard. So they have momentum, and we have momentum with ours as well. So this is a caucus in Congress, in our Congress today, called the Climate Solutions Caucus. It is a completely bipartisan caucus that Citizens Climate Lobby members, our organization, our members, helped to start up this caucus in Congress, okay? Now, this caucus has an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. And in order to join it, if you're a Democrat and you want to join this caucus, you have to find a Republican partner and vice versa. So as it grows, it has to stay 50-50 Republican-Democrat. Now, when I first gave this talk, I think in March 2017, this was a picture of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. And here it is today. Only, what, 5 or 6 months later, if that. It is growing extremely fast right now. Every single time I give this talk, I have to go on the website and get a new picture of the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is excellent. And we have relationships. One of our main things is that when we meet with our elected representatives, we try to steer them toward the Climate Solutions Caucus. Get on the Climate Solutions Caucus. Start talking across the aisle about climate change. This is one of our major pushes. And we have lots of great relationships with the members of this caucus. The New York Times, I believe in June, did a profile, it could be around June. The New York Times did a nice profile of Citizens Climate Lobby. And in it, they interviewed some of the representatives on this caucus. And one Republican representative in particular said that she was considered a lost cause with climate change by most people until she started talking to us about carbon fee and dividend. And then, our kind of we meet with them, didn't assume that they were anti-climate change policy because they're Republican or anything. Just told them about the issue, we told them about our plan. Next thing you know, she is on the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, and she relates the story herself in the New York Times. And it's now getting big enough to take action. So, they recently introduced a spending bill, unfortunately, to address some of the problems of building higher seawalls on the East Coast and things like that. We would prefer them. So that's a climate adaptation bill where we spend lots of money to combat climate change. We would prefer to get a mitigation bill going where carbon fee and dividend, where we actually start stabilizing the climate. They also recently acted to block. Some language that one representative tried to put into a defense bill. In this particular defense bill, there was language that required an annual climate change review to assess the dangers of climate change on our nation's national security. And a representative introduced an amendment to block the climate change language and remove this requirement to do a climate change review. And this caucus kicked in. This Republican, Carlos Curbelo, called up fellow Republican caucus members and said we need to block this. And then the caucus got together and they blocked this amendment and stopped that language from being blocked and made it so that our defense industry, or our military, is still going to be doing this climate change review every year. Okay? So, this is our path with our legislation. And it is very possible that either in this Congress or the next, you will see one of these two bills coming out. Either the carbon dividends bill or a carbon fee and dividend from Citizens Climate Lobby. And we are out here talking to people about it because we want everyone to know about it. If it does come up before Congress, we want everyone to know that it's not going to hurt the economy. Its goal is solely to stabilize the climate. And then we would also ask that in conversations with other people, you say that there is a way to address climate change without being a drag on the economy. Okay, so we've learned through our activities that politicians do not create political will to address problems. They respond to it. We have to generate that political will, and it works. And one of the most impressive things I've ever read was that New York Times article, and listening to Mia Love. She was the representative, the Republican representative, who said, I couldn't care less about climate change before Citizens Climate Lobby got to me, and now she's on the caucus, and she's at least partially sold on the idea that something like this would be a good idea. So they respond to it. So one of the things and I'll take some questions in a minute, anything you have questions about. So one of the things we ask at these talks is that if you are inclined to send a message to your representative, to your congressional representative, about the need to address climate change, we have these forms on which you can write a brief personal note, just saying, hey, climate change is on my mind. I appreciate everything you do for me as my representative. I would appreciate it also if you would take climate change seriously. And think about, for instance, joining the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, or think about taking a look at Citizen Climate Lobby's legislative plan. So if you were to choose to fill out one of these forms tonight, then that's the type of message you could write. A nice, respectful message, thankful message to your representative, suggesting they take a closer look at climate change, and maybe perhaps joining the Climate Solutions Caucus and supporting our legislation. Okay. All right, so we will start to get those forms out in a minute for people who are interested, but that does end my presentation, so thank you all for listening. And does anybody have questions about anything? Yes?
So you said you talked a lot with these different governments, so do you find you get more positive, or do people just, like the representatives and stuff, do you find that they're open to your ideas, or do you get more?
Well, locally, so we're organized by chapters, and we're the Greater Naperville Area Chapter, and we deal with 4 districts. We deal with 14, 6, and 11. And when you meet with the congressional representatives, you can only meet with the people for whom you are a constituent. So I personally am a constituent of Representative Foster. He's a Democrat, he's a scientist, and he is vocal about the need to address climate change. And he has been supportive of the idea of a carbon tax. And we gave a talk with him at another church where we appeared at the same talk. I don't want to call it joint talk, but he was a guest of ours, and then he said some words. And we're basically on the same page. I can't say he 100% endorses our plan because he can't say that yet. But we've made a lot of progress with Foster, and he's very amenable to it. The Republicans in our area, Roscoe and Halpern, are a little bit more difficult to reach, but we have made a lot of progress lately in arranging meetings with them. And I don't know, Terry, if you want to say anything about some upcoming developments with Roscoe in particular.
Well, I can't about Roscoe, but our Illinois representative, if you live near this church, your Illinois representative is probably David Olson, and he's a former student of mine. He was going to come tonight, but he had another meeting, and he is interested in our plan. And he's a Republican. He really believes that climate needs to be addressed, and he is going to help us advocate for this plan with Representative Roscoe, if we can get that meeting. So
And we have very few members in Halpern's district, which is 14. So Foster's very receptive. Roscoe we're making progress with, and then Halpern, we don't have a lot of members in Halpern's district. But when you talk to people, I have found people to be very receptive. So for example, when I've given these talks at different places, I sometimes have people who come up to me afterward who consider themselves conservative and haven't necessarily thought of climate change as an issue worth addressing. And have said, you know what? They say, it makes sense. Maybe it's worth it. So, if people just talk about it and dialogue about it, then you make progress, Yes?
This plan sounds great for the United States and perhaps for China if they got involved with it. But what about the rest? What kinds of plans and things can be put into effect in Europe, other parts of Asia?
It's a good question. So what other types of plans can be put into effect in Europe and other parts of Asia? So when you talk about the varying types of plans you can use to mitigate carbon emissions, you have cap and trade, you have straight up, regulation telling your economic actors you cannot emit this amount, you have to reduce your carbon emissions. You have carbon taxes. So when you look economically at how hard these things are to do, for instance, regulation, you need a very stable government, a relatively wealthy nation with very strong institutions that can go around and enforce the regulation. Okay? So when you talk about like a small African or Asian nation that may not have a lot of revenue, may not have the most stable government, regulation is actually the hardest thing for them to do. Cap and trade is also pretty complicated because you have to set up carbon markets, there's regulation involved, you have to have inspectors making sure that the companies aren't, emitting more than they're supposed to and this and that. And that's also pretty hard to do, and that's also pretty hard to do for a country without a stable government and a strong kind of, strong central government, I guess is what I'm saying. So when you look at the only one that's really suitable for the rest of the world, it's the carbon tax. That's the easiest thing to execute. When you look at cost of administration, the carbon tax is by far has the least cost of administration to any central government. So to get the big economic players in the world, ourselves, Europe, and China doing it, and then that's just a domino effect, and then everyone starts falling toward it. And again, it's easiest for small governments to do, and it's also most beneficial for small governments to do because a government can choose to keep the revenue, right? And then they have a little more revenue to work with if they're a small government. Like if some small government chooses to pass a carbon tax plan, it doesn't have to be our carbon fee and dividend plan. To satisfy our trade requirement, it just has to be a carbon tax where they're taxing carbon.
Could you explain how the carbon credits work?
Carbon credits would be in a cap and trade situation, where in a cap and trade situation, you basically tell companies they can emit this many units of carbon into the atmosphere, okay? And the companies are supposed to be incentivized to not emit a lot of carbon, because if they do emit too much carbon and go over their limit, they're going to have to buy carbon allowances, which are supposed to be expensive. But the reason why this hasn't worked is because in the carbon allowance markets they've set up, they don't tend to be expensive, so companies aren't incentivized to avoid having to buy them. Likewise, they can choose to emit less than their limit, and then they have some extra carbon allowances or carbon credits, and then they can sell those on the carbon allowance market to other companies that need to buy them.
It seems to me that doesn't really effectively lower the level of carbon in here.
Yeah, so it was supposed to incentivize companies to reduce carbon emissions, but it didn't because the prices of carbon allowances never got very high. So companies didn't care about having to buy more, and they didn't care about trying to save them up to sell them because it didn't earn them anything. They say that they need to be like $25 per ton to be worth it for companies, and they end up falling down towards like $7 per ton, just being almost worthless. And also, there's been a lack of flexibility in the cap and trade systems where the natural decrease in energy intensity has been a little higher than expected, and the carbon caps haven't kept up with that. So they just haven't been executed well. And, the carbon allowance prices just aren't sustained. They're not sustaining the demand for carbon allowances. And that's why cap and trade really has been pretty effective. Yes?
You said that ExxonMobil actually was on board for one of these. You said ExxonMobil was actually on board for one of these taxes. Why would they be on board?
They endorsed the Climate Leadership Council's carbon dividends plan. They're not on the board, but they endorsed it saying, we support this legislation.
It's amazing.
So a number of oil companies, my answer to that is, because I've been reading a lot about this, and I've listened to some lectures from oil company executives about this type of thing. And we tend to think of the oil companies, Exxon, Shell, we tend to think of them as oil companies. But globally, and in their own minds, they think of themselves as energy companies, okay? And they know, because Shell has been saying it for decades, and Exxon's been saying it for decades, they know there's a limited shelf life on fossil fuels, primarily because of climate change. I was recently listening to a lecture from a Shell oil executive who said that when they propose a new project for exploration for new fossil fuel sources, they do it based on an assumed $40 per ton carbon tax, in a worldwide $40 per ton carbon tax. And if their project cost doesn't kind of pass the test of a $40 per ton carbon tax, they are very hesitant to go forward with that project because they're expecting it. And this executive is saying, we know we're going to have to get ourselves off of fossil fuels. So they're kind of in this situation where what they want is market certainty. They don't want this wishy-washy, we have regulation, we don't have regulation, we have this, we don't have that. They want market certainty so that they know it is time now to start shifting their operations over to clean energy away from fossil fuels. We need those companies to help with this because they have all the engineering expertise for energy, they have all like the scaling expertise for getting energy systems up to scale that can supply an entire economy. We need them. And they know they're going to be doing it. They just need kind of the market forces to support their drive in that direction. And so a carbon fee supports that drive toward clean energy that they can then justify spending on investing in clean energy. But they need to know that the demand for fossil fuels are going to fall. And that's what a carbon fee does. It raises the price of fossil fuels and lowers the demand for fossil fuels. Exxon, Rex Tillerson, he's the current Secretary of State. He was the CEO of Exxon for a long time, and he has come out in his Senate hearings in confirmation for the Secretary of State position. He came out and said that he supported a carbon tax. And you can read it in the transcript of the Senate hearings. And the new Exxon CEO has said the same. There was a question here before. I just want to make sure I don't ignore it. I thought I saw a hand up to his answer. Great. Anybody else? Yes.
So I'm a little puzzled as to how this works.
Huh?
So for example, let's say ExxonMobil or BP or wherever decides to go along with this plan, then how would that factor into me buying a gallon of gas? What happens to the price of gas?
So the price of gas in the first year goes up about 13 cents per gallon. And then every year after that, now you got to factor out all the other normal fluctuations of gas, right? Because you can have 40-cent fluctuations in a couple months, So you get 13, but you get a steady rise, assuming there's no other fluctuation, you get 13 cents, about 13-cent rise in the gallon of gas for the first year, and then about another 8 to 9 cents every year after that, just keeps rising.
Right.
Yeah. Now, then you start, moving more toward the electric car market with battery storage, and then you can start talking about, well, how do you get a grid to supply? Now, the batteries are getting there with cars. Like the Teslas can go, 230 miles, 240 miles on a single charge. And those are, without getting too crazy, those are mon-ionic batteries, and they're working on bi- and tri-ionic batteries that can go 2 to 3 times that distance. They just got to get that technology now. To get that technology now, they need more investment dollars. To get the investment dollars, they need to be on fossil fuels to steer most of the dollars toward that direction. And then in terms of getting because driving electric cars doesn't necessarily reduce carbon emissions. For example, if you drive an electric car in China, so much of their power comes from coal. It's actually worse than driving gasoline powered cars in China. In Illinois, since we have a lot of nuclear power, driving an electric car is about 50% better than driving a gasoline car. But even through some energy suppliers around here, you can buy all solar or all wind power. But then it comes, how do we get the whole grid? How do we get the whole electrical grid on solar and wind or nuclear? There's emotional resistance to nuclear because it's a scary thing. Nuclear meltdowns are feared. People fear that nuclear would be a great source, but nuclear plants take a long time to build because of regulation and so on and so forth. So the ultimate question is, to get away from the expensive gas, you need an electric car powered by wind or solar, and so we need better storage systems in our grids for intermittent solar and wind energy because the wind isn't always blowing and the sun isn't always shining. And there's you can get chemical storage, so China is already building huge battery farms that are storing solar and wind energy, so that at night these battery farms power cities, okay? That's electrical storage. In the United States, there's actually a lot of movement towards mechanical storage of energy. So you have the sun shining during the day, and you have the solar generators producing more power than a city needs. You use that extra power to, for example, pump water uphill. And then at night, when the sun's not shining, you let the water fall down the hill and turn a turbine. It becomes hydroelectric power.
Going to help the climate, and of course embedded in your presentation was that everyone's going to benefit from the dividend. Together that sounds like a free lunch.
Yep. Well, it's not a free lunch because the fossil fuel industry has to adjust. Remember, the idea here is that this is the fossil fuel industry, of course, has tremendous wealth. And a lot of that wealth has come on the back of society because they've externalized some of their costs to society. So this is not necessarily a free lunch. We've paid for this lunch. And now we're getting our money back, is the idea. It's funny, I was talking with an economics teacher at school who teaches AP economics. We were talking about this idea of externalities. And he said, oh, that's almost the entire goal of all economic activity, is to externalize as much cost as you can to the rest of society. That's how you amass massive wealth, is to externalize costs to everybody else. So this fee just recollects that money, because we've already paid. We're paying now, so it's not free. We're paying. But that being said, it doesn't. The dividend isn't a profit for everyone. The wealthiest in our society are not going to see a profit from $400 a month, carbon dividend when they spend so much in society. So yeah, for some people, the wealthier among us, there will be an increase in the cost of living that they will not recoup, but that maxes out at about 2% of an increase in the cost of living, which, and they still have, it still embraces the market in such a way that they can choose to alter their spending habits and not lose that 2% of their money. Because ultimately, a wealthy person needs the same amount of food that we do, So the dividend at least makes up for the increase in necessities, right? And they can change their spending habits however they want. It's their choice. They still want to drive like a Ferrari that consumes gasoline like crazy. Great. I love Ferraris. I'd love to have a Ferrari. But you just got to pay a more fair price for it so that everybody else doesn't have to shoulder that burden of the externalized cost. Yeah. Bill? Yes.
Earlier in the presentation, you talked about insurance claims as a cost, social unrest, disputes, and so on. What does the insurance industry, the Defense Department, these kind of agencies, organizations feel about climate change?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So what do the insurance industry and the defense industry and the investment industry, what do they feel about climate change? And that's where it gets really interesting, because if you look behind the scenes at those industries, if you look at their academic papers, their academics, they all take climate change very, very, very seriously. Everybody was thinking that, what's the new chief of staff? He's a military guy. Sorry?
John Kelly.
Yeah, John Kelly. Everybody was thinking that he was going to change the flow of climate change information going to Trump, because Kelly is a military guy, and the military is very keenly aware of the threat of climate change, not only to our installations, but to global political stability. The military, and when you read defense articles about how the military thinks about climate change, they're extremely concerned. The insurance industry takes climate change projections from academics very, very seriously. I recently read a paper from a think tank that actually was an offshoot. It's called it's either the K Street or the R Street Institute. It's an offshoot of the Heartland Institute, which is known for being very conservative. And they released a paper that they focus almost exclusively on the insurance industry. And the reason why they broke away from the Heartland Institute is because the insurance industry takes climate change very seriously. So in all their papers, they talk a lot about climate change. And in one of the editorials from their president, he said that there is not a single major insurer in this country that discounts the future impacts of climate change, even though any insurance industry who prices their products cheaper because they think climate change isn't going to happen or isn't happening can get a short-term competitive advantage over other insurance players. Not a single insurance company is doing that because they know it is going to sink them in 20 or 30 years. Because you're going to keep getting more Irmas and more Harveys and all that kind of stuff, and the insurers, if they don't price their things right, they're not going to survive. So if an insurance company doesn't pay attention to climate change and price their products accordingly, even though they can get a short-term economic and competitive advantage, none of them are doing it. And then the investment industry, I read a 2013 article from Deutsche Bank saying that 50% of hedge fund managers are starting to see the writing on the wall for fossil fuel related investments and so on and so forth. So behind the scenes, a lot of momentum is shifting. And even in government with this bipartisan climate solutions caucus, this is gaining a lot of momentum. And to be honest, this may be a surprise coming from a climate change speaker, but I was a little bit kind of happy when Trump pulled out of Paris, or said he was going to pull out of Paris, because that puts the pressure on Congress, where we think with our legislation, it needs to be. It just needs to be a congressional thing where they put this fee on carbon, this rising fee on carbon. So for everybody to be resting happily thinking Paris is going to take care of this, it's kind of good that people now know, no, Paris is not going to take care of this. We need to get something like this, and then this will take care of it. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure quite how to word this, but coming from a state that has seen a lot of mountaintop removal and,
Yep.
taking the coal off
Yep.
the top and the devastation that that has caused in their communities, how is this going to do anything for that? Is that still going to continue?
The mountaintop removal? Well, ideally, the demand for coal will plummet. The demand for coal is plummeting anyway, but the demand for coal will plummet faster with this. And that kind of relates, remember how we said that one of the tenets of that study was that there would be 230,000 fewer premature deaths due to the pollution from fossil fuels? The mountaintop removal would be a factor in that. There's 230,000 fewer premature deaths. It's probably a smaller factor than, say, just citywide air pollution from all these cars driving around cities. But yeah, just generally less awful pollution from fossil fuel mining operations and fossil fuel burning. Because if you just reduce the demand for fossil fuel, you reduce all of it.
But they're not going to replace all the...
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, unfortunately.
Just
Yeah.
check it.
But over time, nature has its way and it'll recover as long as you don't blow it up again. Yes.
You said you were happy about pulling out of Paris. What did Paris not do that your solution does?
Paris was voluntary, first of all. So everything that we were, quote, committed to do was actually voluntary. We just had to set our own standards within certain parameters. And this isn't, remember I mentioned that the Climate Leadership Council spokesman, Ted Halstead, gave a TED Talk. So in his talk, he shows where the Paris climate targets were. So if we followed Paris to the T and did the most aggressive climate mitigation that Paris wants us to do, we would reduce, carbon emissions by this much, whatever. And then the Climate Leadership Council, they kind of target that Paris target. But our target is actually considerably lower. And the reason is because our legislation eventually makes fossil fuels very, very, very expensive. And I'm going to be honest with you here, I never paid much attention to Paris. I was never very impressed with Paris. I don't know that much about the details of Paris. I know that it was voluntary. I know that if under best case scenario, it would reduce us a certain amount, but not enough to really stabilize the climate. It was a thing that was meant to kind of get the ball rolling. Whereas this kind of drops the ball off the mountaintop and just says, let's get this done. So it's just more drastic cut to the demand in fossil fuels and a much quicker reduction in emissions.
Is there any possibility of implementing at a state level, which would kind of start rolling the ball towards the federal road?
It's difficult because to do the, I forget the term for it, subnational. To do subnational carbon taxes is very tricky because you still have lots of interstate trade, and it pushes business out of the state. Just look at the soda tax. Right? One of the big problems with the soda tax right now is that small businesses are suffering because people are just going to the next county over to get drinks, and then they're buying other groceries in the next county over. That's kind of the effect you get with a subnational carbon tax. So if like Illinois had a carbon tax, for example, it would be tricky to keep Illinois, competitive with other states in terms of businesses wanting to locate here and all that kind of stuff. So you really want to do kind of a national. Yeah.
Can I address that?
Yeah, sure.
Some places have tried it, or actually not in the U.S., but like the British Columbia example, that's a subnational thing, but they can't get the price high enough, really. I mean, they have got reductions, but the reductions that they have are not really enough to stabilize the climate. So to get really good reductions, it has to be national.
Yeah, and I also understand that in British Columbia, they exempted agriculture because it was subnational. They had
It
to exempt-
actually has to be international, and our
Yeah.
plan has this mechanism, has this incentive that pushes other countries to adopt a similar program.
Yeah, and that's our power here is our consumer market, right? Because we consume, I don't know what percentage of the world's goods, but more than is represented by our population. No one's going to want to stop exporting to us, and they're not going to want to pay our treasury a carbon tax. So it's just, and all of these, when you read between the lines in these discussions with politicians, like everybody's just kind of waiting for someone else to do it. It feels like you really get that sense. Or everybody's just kind of waiting for one country to do it, and then almost, a lot of the major players are just kind of ready to go. But it's just getting that political will for that one major player to take that first step, and then it should just go. And that's there's a nice animation in the TED Talk by the Climate Leadership Council. They have like all the dominoes, and they have the dominoes with the flags. There's an American domino, a Chinese domino, a Russian domino, and there's like a European Union domino. And like one of these is going to go, and then once that goes, they all go. And they're kind of this is kind of on the brink. You just got to get it done. Okay, is there any other questions? Yes.
The dividend is actually a check in the mail. Then.
Or
So we're gonna pay it.
direct deposit? Yeah. Yeah, it's a payment. The dividend is a payment. It is not a tax reduction or a tax deduction or a rebate or anything like that. And it's monthly. Because if you want people to keep up with their monthly expenses, you can't give them an end of the year tax rebate. Right? You gotta give them monthly checks if they're gonna keep up with their increased costs. Okay. Yeah.
Any sense as to, we talked about whether or not the money flows through government or goes to the citizens. Obviously, we need a middle ground. Any sense as to how much the government's cut could be and it's still not make people pessimistic about it?
Well, our firm commitment in this legislation is that the government gets no cut. The only thing that's removed is administrative fees. So 100% of the net revenue is returned to the public after administrative fees. And if I recall from the study, administrative fees would start off at about 6% of the revenue. And then as the revenue grows, that percentage of the revenue just plummets because the revenue gets so big. And the system gets more. Now, a lot of the systems are already in place. They can use the Social Security administrators, money distribution system to send out the rebate check. So no, it's 100% of that net revenue goes back to the people. The only thing that's kept by the government is administrative. And that's actually one of the things that when we talk to Democratic representatives, they want sometimes to keep something. Like, can we use a little bit of the money for this or that or this or that? And we're always, no, you gotta give it back to everybody. Otherwise it will not stick.
So the reduction in fossil fuel use will eventually stop fracking and
Fracking, mountaintop
pipelines
removal,
running through Native American.
ocean spill, all that stuff. Because you just don't, eventually, I'm not gonna say eventually you won't need fossil fuels at all. There's always gonna be a place for fossil fuels, but eventually it'll be a much, much smaller part of our energy supply. And you won't have all these massive problems caused by mining and spills and pollution and all that stuff. All right, well, thank you, everyone.